Hello, students from CSP 400, Intro to the Helping Professions. This will be from chapter 6, and I am just catching up for those of you who were not able to make it to class the other day, but I did want to make sure that you had access to this lecture on the helping process. So let's get right into it. All right. So, I talked a bit about kind of how we do the helping process. And then hopefully if you're reading your book, Corey, you're into the ideas about what it takes to move someone through the helping process. Last time we talked about transference and countertransference. This time we'll take a look about more about our own kind of beliefs and evaluating certain assumptions. And so I'm coming really from my experience working with cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and how CBT challenges our ideas about what must be, what should be, what ought to be, and really gets us moving to be more open to change. Because usually if we're stuck somewhere, we need to be more open to other possibilities. So in critically evaluating our assumptions, right, we examine our beliefs regarding a client's capacity to change and the role of the helper and client relationship in bringing about change. And I just want to pause here to talk about two big ideas, right? One that may or may not be in your book, especially like as a direct vocabulary word, but these two ideas are woven throughout the conversation. The first is expectancy. And I'll say that again, expectancy. Right? My belief that I expect something to change. So in my work, mostly with solution focused counseling, but a bit also with CBT, right? I am working in my initial assessments or evaluation with a client to see what is their expectation that they could possibly change. But I would also say there's a part where there's expectancy of the helper, right? In their sense that they can really be in the capacity to help somebody, because sometimes you need to make a referral out. So expectancy, right? Now I'm going to shift gears to the second vocabulary word that's still woven throughout, but we're not quite bringing out, but it's called efficacy. How effective do I think I can be in these new skills, right? So that's for the client, or that's for the person being helped, right? Efficacy. But often what isn't talked about very directly in many different contexts are the efficacy of the helper. How effective do I think I could be in helping somebody to change, right? Now, I may have an expectation that that person can change, but I may not be at the skill set, or my skill set may not be the one that will be effective. But I do expect that this person can change because of prior cases that I may be aware of, or current science that I'm reading about, or that the issue is, it seems like a heavy burden to that person, but there are many other people who've gone through heavier things. Either way, expectancy and efficacy are two concepts that go together, and they're kind of interwoven throughout this conversation. So I wanted to start there with both of those two, and I'll say that again, expectancy and efficacy. And I wanted us to keep that in mind because I'll come back to those themes. Right, moving on to the next bullet point. If you live in an encapsulated environment, you may see only what confirms your existing belief, right? And some of these ideas are also within attribution theory, right? And if you're familiar with educational psychology or cognitive psychology, there's a lot of conversations about attribution theory. And what do I attribute my success or failures to with attribution theory, right? So again, I want folks to approach this situation with an open mind, because we find that people who are resistant to change, they're less likely to actually make those changes. So moving over to these arrows here on the right side of your screen, instead of saying it's so frustrating they don't speak English in relation to working with English language learners, try it's so frustrating that I can only speak English. That goes to my efficacy, as well as my expectancy that an English language learner who's in my classroom, or who comes to my store, or who I interact with on some other business matter, that they're able to change, but also that we're able to create some type of synergy that we grow together, right? Again, that's another term called reframing that was used quite a bit in the 80s and 90s when I was coming up in the psychology world, reframing. But it's a different way to begin to open our minds to possibilities. So what type of helper are you, right? And again, I mentioned that term efficacy. Do you see yourself as being effective, or do you see yourself as being ineffective? And that's not necessarily a judgment. It may be the limit of the skill set that you have at that moment. But there may be things that you're already gifted with, or you've had experiences that indicate that, yes, I am effective in these areas, and I'd like to be more effective in other areas. But I want you thinking about that as you're developing. So these stages of the helping process, right? We begin by establishing a working relationship and being clear about who it is you are. And I'm very clear when I work with somebody about the bounds of my abilities and what it is I can do. More often now, I'm an advocate or I'm a consultant. So I want people to be clear that I'm not your counselor, I'm not your therapist. I'm not even your friend in that regards. This is a business relationship, and here's the working relationship that we have. But when I was a counselor, I would say again, I'm unlike any other person you have in your environment. I'm not your parents. I'm not your best friend. Although we may be friendly, I'm here to help you work on specific goals. So we establish the working relationship. Next, we identify whatever the client's problems are, right? And I could do this even as an advocate or a consultant, but if I'm narrowing down to being a counselor, I'm identifying those problems. And if I'm narrowing down to being someone who's helping them with a specific skill, like learning how to read better, like learning how to do math better, like learning how to speak better, those specific skills, right? We're focusing in on those goals, right? And helping them create goals. They may want some very broad outcomes or have a vision for what they'd like, but we're narrowing down on those goals. And that's the third point here. Moving on to the fifth. We're encouraging the client to explore and take action. And with that exploration, we may be practicing new skills, and then they're going to take and generalize or move those skills out into the real world, as it were, outside of our client and helper relationship. They're going to try that in real time, right? And then they'll come back and say, oh man, I didn't do well in that one, but the victory that I had was that I even tried, right? And then eventually, after they've developed the skills in relation to the goals, then the termination comes. And I think it's important to be clear about goals so you know when you're done. A lot of people don't like counseling in particular because they don't know when it's done. They have no idea. So I find that the goal development part is the most important. Thus, I have a whole webpage and a podcast called The Goal Doctor. And if you want to learn more about what I think about goals, and I'm not trying to advertise it because I get no money from it. I just really like to put that out there that I think people really get helped more if they know how to develop goals. So if you look up goaldoctor.net, you'll be able to find more about it if you're really interested in goal development. If not, don't worry about it. Won't hold it against you for class. All right, establishing a working relationship, right? So we need to create a climate for change. And having that climate for change, again, goes back to our expectancy, right? The expectations that we have, and establishing the relationship, I think is important, but how effective do we think we can be? And I think it's good to talk about those things. How effective do we think we can be? How much do we expect to solve? And sometimes a client's expectations may be way beyond where they're at. That's why when I talk about on a scale of 1 to 10, I may say, all right, 10 may be weeks away from now. What does a half step look like this week, right? We may make a series of half steps rather than jumping 3 or 4 steps ahead. Right. Again, establishing relationship. We just talked a little bit more about that, but really being clear, maybe even each time what the relationship was about. One of the things that's required by law is confidentiality, right? And discussing confidentiality. And moving on to the third bullet point here, educating the client and obtaining informed consent. That's extremely important to do and discuss confidentiality as you obtain consent. So there where you're clear that this, whatever conversation happens, stays within the two of you, but you're clear about where the relationship is going when it comes to the helping relationship. Right. So if we're narrowing down and identifying the client's problems, we're understanding the environment that they're in and the context that they're bringing. This initial assessment, sometimes it may even involve assessment tools that have been developed by yourself or others. So you have an idea of kind of a checklist, or kind of a rating scale that you're comparing your client to others. And you're helping your clients gain a focus outside of that. Because sometimes people come and they're not exactly sure. They just got a hodgepodge of ideas about how they got into the situation they're in, and they're looking for something, and you can help them at least gain focus. You're more likely to make a goal if you've narrowed down on something to begin with. Again, identifying expectations to one's problems. There's that word again, expectancy. Right. So how do you help clients create goals, right? You have to be aware of the change desired, develop realistic goals, use a problem-solving approach, right? So again, if I were to sit down and stop and pause and talk with a person who I'm working with on their goals, I would be aware of how much they want to change things, right? And then going back to realistic goals, they need to be measurable. They need to be observable to the client and some other people in their lives. And they need to be doable within a certain reasonable amount of time. And so we take a problem-solving approach. So what are the obstacles that have kept you from being able to reach those goals? Okay. So we encourage client exploration and taking action by confronting or sometimes challenging clients. And this is one thing that cognitive behavioral therapy does, reality therapy does very well. Solution-focused counseling doesn't always confront, but it may challenge the client to think about times in the past where they've had similar problems and identify patterns so they don't repeat those patterns. Using helper self-disclosure appropriately, right? If you're the helper, you just don't want to start talking about your own issues and superimpose your own issues or your own way of problem solving onto the client, unless it is an illustration to help the client better understand their situations. So if you do self-disclose, it needs to come back to the client, not just be put out there, right? So you need to identify and assess action strategies. That's extremely important. Once you've started confronting some of these things, you need to have some strategies to begin to practice, as we were talking about earlier. And then you carry out an action program, right? And you get real focused on that. So as we get close towards termination, right? And but these pictures don't quite deal with what I think termination should be about. What I think termination should be about is that, man, we've hit these goals. I'm excited for you, or you've been doing that now for the past 3 weeks or so. It's time for us to start thinking about terminating our progress towards these goals and maybe look towards bigger goals, or you're done and it's time for you to go on and live your life now with these new tools you develop. But that's part of what I do to prepare clients for termination. And terminating when the clients are not benefiting, that's sometimes I'm thinking, okay, we've had a couple of weeks now or 3 weeks now of really unsuccessful efforts. So perhaps it's time for us to consider another person who's more skilled in this particular area. Or when we started, we thought the challenge was one thing, now it's something else. Let's take a look at a referral to somebody else who can really do a good job in this area. So, and we don't want to foster dependency as well, especially if the client is too focused in on only able to do the activities within the client and helper space. They need sometimes to move outside of that space. And so, yeah, we all need skills for ending a relationship, but I think those skills are heightened when we understand what the outcomes we are expecting and the goals we are expecting. And if we're not able to get measurable progress, then it's time to move forward. Or if we are able to get that measurable progress, we're able to say, all right, excitement, celebration, let it go like a great graduation should be. All right. Those are some of the thoughts with it. I'm going to end with something that we didn't, that I did in the class. And it was really around solution-focused therapy. So if you're ready, I want you to think of, and I'm going all the way back to the beginning so you can focus a little bit. If you're ready, I want you to think of a time when you had a problem, right? And I want you to think of a problem that's occurring right now as well, because I'm going to take you back a little bit, but a problem that's occurring in your life now. Okay, you thought of it, right? And closing your eyes, you're thinking of it, okay. I want you to think of how long you've had that problem. Right? And I want you to think of, as well, a time in your life when you did not have that problem. Was there anything different about then and now? If there was something different, great. What was going on? Now, it may not have to do with anything. Perhaps let's shift gears a little bit. There's a time when you had a similar problem. All right, you're aware of that similar problem. What did you do to help overcome that problem? Or even gain some level of progress? Maybe you didn't quite overcome it, but you gained some level of progress. What could you do? Perhaps you're closer to solving that problem than you think. Or the solution was a challenge before, but perhaps there's somebody you can call this time that may be able to help you with this problem. Or a book you can read, or something you could listen to, or some time you can devote to thinking it through. Either way, or maybe all of those things. So we're going to end this kind of exercise on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being, oh man, this problem is overwhelming me and I don't know what I'm going to do. 10 being, it's no big deal. Figure out where you're at, because when you come back to class next week, I want you to start thinking about, what would a half step up look like? What is my expectation that I can move a half step up? That half step is where your goal development should be, where you're making measurable, observable, and doable goals. Write down at least 1 or 2 goals that will show you within the next week that you've made some progress in this issue. All right, that's it. Thanks for tuning in to chapter 6 and the helping process. Looking forward to seeing you in class. Have a great day.